Nottingham, England, at home.
You're not originally from Nottingham.
No, I mostly from Norfolk, in England. I was born in Bermuda, but I only lived there for about 6 months. So Norfolk is my home place, I guess.
I first came across your work several years ago. I was in this great bookstore in Brookline, Massachusetts. This cover caught my eye with all these different images on it, including, I think it was a big eye with sparkly eyeshadow on it, and that was If Nobody Speaks of Remarkable Things.
Hmm.
And your book grabbed me, to say the least. And one of the big reasons why was I couldn't tell at first if I was reading a poem or if I was reading prose. Talk to me about how you wrote that book and those intersections of poetry and prose.
Hmm. It's interesting when people talk about that book and about poetry. It's something that I think other people see more than I saw while I was writing it, and I was not setting out to write something that would be read as being poetic or being poetry, and I wasn't even setting out. I wasn't even setting out to write something that would be kind of non-traditional or experimental. I was just I wanted to convey the sense of that place as clearly as I could and as expressively as I could. And so the way that it ended up being laid out on the page was just what came naturally to me. And I think I came to writing that novel with very few preconceptions of what a novel should be. I'd started writing much shorter pieces. When I first started writing, I was writing very, very short fiction and then kind of longer short stories. And eventually someone said to me, you need to write a novel. If you're going to get anywhere, if you want to be published and published successfully, you need to write a novel. And so I kind of came to it almost quite reluctantly, without any kind of sense of what a novel has to be. And so, I mean, those first few pages, for example, I was writing this kind of soundscape of the city at night as a way of drawing the reader into the location, and so it's almost entirely descriptive. There's no kind of narration in there until you get to the end, and there's the couple dancing, and then you follow them back to the street, and that kind of brings the reader into the start of the story. And yeah, it's just the way it came out, really.
I think that book is a great example of one of the things that I really love about your writing is how you're really able to tease out some of the tiniest details and really kind of put a spotlight on them. And it's beautiful language and these beautiful little things that really would go unnoticed during the hustle and bustle of everyday life. Is that the way that you look at the world outside of when you're sitting at your desk writing?
I think that's the way all writers look at the world, or I think it's the way a lot of people look at the world. And I mean, this is going back nearly 10 years now, but when the book was first read by people, it surprised me how many people picked up on that as a kind of as a feature of it, because until that point, that had been a way that I'd quite unselfconsciously looked at the world, and ever since then, there's been this slightly unwelcome self-consciousness has crept in, where I find myself noticing something, and I kind of think, well, oh look, I'm being a writer now. I'm noticing that thing, and I'm keeping a note of it, or finding some scrap of shopping list on the ground and keeping it. And to me, that comes naturally. It's just and yeah, it's what I'm interested in. It's what I've continued with that book. It was a very particular motif about the small details of life being interesting. But actually, in all my other stories and my other writing, I think I tend to build the story up through the small details rather than through any big grand kind of delineation of character or place. It's the small things that count, I think.
You've spent some time living on a boat. You've traveled pretty extensively on trains. I know that you've been on the Trans-Siberian and Trans-Mongolian railways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In this day of jet setting, why are you living on boats and taking the train?
I'm taking the train as mostly as a kind of deliberate environmental thing. Planes are a very significant and growing contributor to carbon emissions and the greenhouse effect and climate change. And travel generally is a big issue as part of the picture of carbon emissions. So I've for a long time now, wherever possible, I've taken the train instead of flying. And within Europe, that's fairly straightforward. You can get an overnight train to most of Europe. And the trip to Japan was partly that, and partly just it seemed like a fun thing to do. And I'd had some money. I won the If Nobody Speaks Remarkable Things won a prize, and the condition of the prize was that you spent the money on travel. So that seemed a good thing to do. And it took nearly 2 weeks to get to Japan on the train and the boats. And it was really interesting to see. Actually, the world is really big. I think people are so accustomed to, say, from the UK to Japan, it's a 10-hour flight or something, and you go to Heathrow and you get on a plane and you eat some food, and then you're in Tokyo, and there's no kind of sense of place or transition or adjustment. And whereas traveling by train, you go through Western Europe and you go through Eastern Europe, and then you're in Russia, and there's forests everywhere, and there's people living in log cabins, and as you go through the different time zones, people are eating slightly different food, and the dialect is slightly different, and the dress is slightly different, and all these things that we think that we've lost, all these kind of differences that we think we've lost, they're all still there. And if you travel overland, you can kind of see. And so by the time we arrived in Japan, there was no sense of culture shock or abruptness or dislocation, because we'd kind of, I don't know, been through the airlock, as it were. And so that was a great experience, a really, really great experience.
Your story, If It Keeps on Raining, runner-up for the BBC's National Short Story Award last year, about a man who builds a treehouse in event of a coming flood. Where did that story come from?
I started writing it a long time ago, 8 or 9 years ago, when I was living on a boat. And it was a year when it rained a lot, and there were lots of floods, and the boat we were living on, it kind of the windows and the roof leaked quite a lot, and so the rain was a big issue for me. And I think it was the first flood that I'd properly seen in kind of close proximity. The river, the boat was on a canal, and the river right next to the canal flooded, and just the kind of the power of that. And you're seeing caravans, rushing past, and trees just rushing past. The kind of the power of it was quite frightening, and so just kind of thinking about that, and it gave rise to the idea of this man who isn't based on anybody in particular, but it's kind of a composite of a lot of people I was meeting at that time, a lot of men living on their own in boats or in caravans or in cabins, who I was meeting through being part of this kind of community of people who live on boats. And a lot of them were damaged in various ways, and were divorced or separated or lost touch with their children, and were just very kind of angry about everything, and had great trouble expressing that. It just struck me as an interesting story and an interesting kind of view of the world.
Even the Dogs. That's a story about, or I should say a novel, about people falling through the cracks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Why these kinds of lives are you choosing to focus on right now?
With Even the Dogs, it was quite particular. I heard a story. My wife works with homeless people, and quite some years ago, 5-6 years ago, she one of the people that she was working with died in his flat over Christmas, and his body wasn't found for a couple of weeks, and the fact that was such a typical story and not at all an unusual story somehow really stuck with me and really kind of caught my attention and made me want to try and write about it. And so I sat down and wrote what eventually became the first chapter of Even the Dogs. and then was really aware that this was turning into a story about big issues, a story about drugs and about alcoholism and about exclusion and poverty. And just, it didn't feel like a book I should be writing. It didn't feel like a book I wanted to write. And so I actually put it away and kind of put it to one side and decided not to write it. But it kept nagging away at me, and I kept finding out more and more little snippets of information about heroin use and about addiction and about rehab and about people living in squats and derelict buildings and on the street. I had to come back to it, and I had to write it. And once I found a way in to a sense of who the characters were and a way to represent them on the page, it just kind of took over, and I wrote it really quite quickly once I went back to it.
What does your wife think of the novel?
Yeah, she wasn't the biggest fan at first. It's quite dark and it's quite bleak, and there's not very much hope in it. And I think she struggled with that initially. But she read a very early draft, which was even darker and even bleaker, and I think she's happy with the finished version. But I was quite keen, when the publishers were putting together the cover and the material to go with it, they kept wanting to talk about redemption and the kind of this idea that there would be some light at the end of the tunnel, and I was saying, well, there isn't any redemption in this book. There's one character who has half a chance of breaking through this kind of struggle that they're all in, but most of them don't make it, and that's the story that I'm trying to tell. That there are people every day struggling and failing to overcome addiction and these lives that they've ended up with.
Whether as a poet or writing novels or short stories or on a train or a boat, you've been a writer for a long time. Why? Why are you a writer?
Because I keep getting away with it, I guess, is how it feels to me. It's something I started doing to see if I can make it work, and so far it's working, and I'm always curious about how to take a vague idea and turn it into a finished piece of work which will make sense to a reader. I love the idea of a reader I've never met reading something I've written and taking some sense of what I was trying to convey. And I just love the idea of those connections that you can make with readers one at a time. Why? I write to try and become a writer. It's a process, and it's something I'm trying to get the hang of, and I enjoy it. I really enjoy it.
Well, Jon McGregor, I have to say, building off of what you just said, you certainly made that connection with me that day that I picked up the book with the funky cover, with the big eye on it, which was If Nobody Speaks of Remarkable Things. So thank you for writing that, and thank you for taking the time to talk with me today.
You're very welcome. It's been fun.